welcome to the Jeff Buller Show. Today I have with me Brett Putter. Now Brett is an expert in company culture and he's developed a whole range of systems and processes to help companies manage their company culture and keep it healthy and thriving. Now with the rise of the pandemic and the COVID, a lot of people are doing remote work, so maintaining company culture obviously is very important and become very important because you're managing remote teams. So we're going to dive in a little bit of that today. So he's the CEO of CultureGene, a culture leadership software and services platform. And before that, he spent 6 years managing partner of a leading executive search firm in London. He originally hails from South Africa. And we're going to have a little chat today about his new book as well. And his second book, well, first book was Culture Decks Decoded, and his second book, Own Your Culture. We're going to have a little bit of chat of that, but we're also going to, I think, spend a lot of time diving into the challenges we have as modern companies in a modern, very fast changing and changed world in terms of remote teams and remote and hybrid work culture. So, welcome to the show, Brett.
Jeff, thanks very much. Great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
So, the first question I'm going to ask you is, what do you define as company culture?
Yeah, so company culture really is this largely invisible, subconscious and intangible thing that happens whether you like it or not. And culture develops when decisions that are made prove to be successful, and the thinking that went into those decisions becomes embedded into the way we do things around here. So in a shortened version, company culture is the way we do things around here. And that's this random combination of good and bad behaviors, habits, principles, beliefs, assumptions, norms, communication styles, etc., etc. And that's really the crux of the matter is it's how we do things versus how other people do things.
Right. Okay. So we're in the middle of this really fast changing world at the moment. And it has brought with its own challenges that have both, I suppose, highlighted the big problems that maybe were underlying already. So what do you see as some of the big challenges with the remote work that we have today?
So the first big challenge is that most CEOs have their heads in the sand. So as you said, from South Africa, it's the ostrich mentality. If you keep your head in the sand for long enough, it'll go away, or it'll come back as normal. And that's not going to happen. The second challenge is that CEOs are thinking, I can run a hybrid environment where we can work sort of 2 or 3 days from the office and 2 days from home. And that means that I won't have to change my leadership style at all, which is not the case. You have to radically change your leadership style to do hybrid or remote work effectively. And the third element of this is that these leaders haven't actually allowed their people to grieve. Mm-hmm. The loss of pre-COVID work is the 5 stages of grief. It's literally, you've got to work through it. Because if you don't work through it, you're always going to be associating back to what it was. And it's never going to be like that again. So those are really the fundamentals from my perspective around the challenges.
So let's raise that little question of the stages of grief that people can go through with work being not the same as it, and it's never going to be the same. Can you tell us a little bit about what that grieving process looks like?
Yeah. So what I actually do is I suggest to my clients that they ask their colleagues, their employees, to write down what they miss about working from an office, and then imagine that that working from an office is like living on Earth, where we walk around in our jeans and t-shirt, gravity does its thing, and we breathe and we eat and we do what we do. But actually now Earth was obliterated and we have to now move to the moon. It's a different work style, a different living style. You know, you don't walk anymore, you jump, etc. Gravity doesn't work the same way. And you've essentially got to communicate to your team that if they and you hark back to those pre-COVID days, whatever you try and land, whatever you try and develop and improve for the future is not going to be as effective because people are holding on to the past. Allow them to let it go and say, yes, we may go back to some of that in the future, but let's just all understand that life is now changed and will change irrevocably.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So for me, I was doing remote work already. So I work from the home office and still do. I suppose for me the challenge too was not only work, it was also the social environment, that you just can't go to a restaurant anymore, especially in some of the countries that have got locked down. And so that's a challenge. So it's also the things that sort of wrap all around the work, isn't it, as well? Not just work itself.
Yeah, exactly. So there's in work and there's outside of work, and they obviously they feed off one another. So what would happen is if you were frustrated after a day of work, you'd go out, have a couple of beers, and shoot the breeze and relax. And now that can't happen. And that then feeds back into work. So if you think about what used to happen, if you were in the office, you'd get into the office and you'd make yourself a coffee, sit down and do an hour's of work, and then have a meeting. And you get up and go to the meeting. But that getting up and going to the meeting allowed you to decompress. Mm-hmm. And then after the meeting, you'd maybe go out for lunch, and that allowed you to decompress. And then you'd have a bit of banter with some of the mates over a glass of water at the water fountain, decompress. Then you travel home. That allowed you to decompress. And maybe you work later, but at least you decompressed. Now we're not decompressing. It's just zoom. And then, so this, the impact of this is on the well-being side and health, wellness, mental health issues, and burnout issues. These are things that remote companies actually prepare for, and they train their managers to be aware of, that nobody that I've spoken to who is working in a co-located environment has even thought about properly yet.
I think that's really, really interesting insights. And I'd like to dive in a little bit further too. So decompress, and could you explain what you mean by decompressing from work and different things you can do? I know I'm just thinking myself through the different things I do to decompress. So explain what you mean exactly by decompress, and what are some of the ways you can decompress?
So the technique that I use that I find most effective, which takes a little bit of getting used to, is called the Pomodoro technique. And this is what a lot of remote workers use. And basically what you do is you turn off all notifications, and you choose whatever you're going to work on, and you set an alarm for 25 minutes, mm-hmm. and you work on that without any interruptions. After 25 minutes, the alarm goes off, you go and get yourself a coffee, or you go for a walk, you go for a stretch, and you spend 5 minutes doing something else. That's your decompression. Then you set another alarm for 25 minutes, and you focus again on either that subject or another subject. But basically, you create forced decompression, which decompression is allowing your brain to extract itself from the screen. Okay. And essentially, which would have happened in an office, because you would have walked to the toilet and then bumped into Jackie and said, "How are you doing, Jackie? How are things going? How are the kids?" etc., etc. So what remote workers do, and actually what companies do, good remote work companies, is they force decompression into the system. Right.
Okay. And they basically remind their staff that this is what they need to do and this is how they can work, because no one really talks about this very much before. I have heard of the 25-minute Pomodoro effect, and I think my editor uses it quite a lot now. He just sets an alarm, turns off all alerts. I've turned off all alerts. I don't set an alarm, but it's something I might certainly try. It's all we're in the middle of this very fast-changing world, which is never going to be the same. There's going to be parts of the same are going to be leftovers, but we're moving into an evolving space that we did not expect, certainly, a year ago. We did not expect this. And so you, for example, work remotely because you moved from London to Portugal.
Exactly. And actually, I've been thinking about moving for the last couple of years because I've got young kids and they're not in the school system yet. So my wife and I were saying, imagine if, and then along came COVID. We thought, actually, because my concern was, will I be able to network and build up, the business? And actually, it turns out that my business is, I'm very fortunate, business has really picked up, because culture is now such a critical issue for most companies. Because essentially what's happening is most companies relied on their offices to develop and manage their culture for them. That's why they could be lazy about their culture. If you compare that to remote work companies, all of them focus on culture from a very early stage, because they can't afford not to. Versus when you're in the office, you can rely on osmosis and random interactions for your culture to propagate what's happening in the environment. But now that the office is gone, the osmosis doesn't happen. And in my book, I actually, in the chapter, I quote Warren Buffett, where I say, I use Warren Buffett's quote where he says, you don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. And, the tide's gone out on a lot of CEOs who didn't do any work on their culture, and they're really struggling now because their culture is degrading every single day because they relied so much on proximity, visibility, availability, informal communication, those water cooler moments. They relied on these things for their culture to propagate. And it actually wasn't intentional. It was unintentional. It was almost as if culture wasn't that important, because it didn't have to be, because the office did it for them.
Yeah, I'm certainly seeing some companies that, and they've been doing it, some of them are doing it for years. They've worked remotely ever since they started. I think one great example of that is Basecamp, the two owners behind Basecamp, and I've read a few of their books, and it's fascinating in that they have built culture and how they work into the remote hybrid model. And it doesn't mean they don't have and I think they may have used to have one office in New York, I think, where a few people get together, but in the main, it's pretty well remote. But you're right, we had accidental culture that occurred because we met in offices, and it's just, I suppose, human nature to evolve around that water cooler moments, chat about what was happening on TV, big show that was going on at the moment, or what's happening in the world. So what I want to dive into a little bit more to look at that structure that you use, and we're going to look at the 9 company culture rules successful remote companies follow. I think I'd like to dive into that structure, and let's have a look at those a little closer. So maybe if you could just tell us, we'll quickly sum up those 9 rules, if you could.
Sure. So the 9 rules, to give you a little bit of context, about a year and a half ago, I was approached by 2 remote companies to help with their culture development. And at the time, I was doing in-person workshops in offices. And I realized that my business was not going to work for remote companies because they're not in offices. So I thought that it would, I suspected over a period of time, longer than COVID, I just could have anticipated, but over a period of time, developing a software solution for these companies would be valuable. And so I started doing some research into Basecamp, as you mentioned, GitLab, Hotjar, Buffer, Zapier, TopTel, Automatic, and a whole bunch of others. And essentially, I realized that there are 9 best practices that these companies focus on above what we would typically focus on in a co-located environment. And that is, they really work hard on the following things: social connection, communication, processizing the business, documentation, developing trust, outcomes-based leadership, recruitment and onboarding, well-being, and then the 9th is being deliberate about their culture. And they when I talk to leaders, they say, yeah, but Brett, we have Friday drinks and we have a lot of social stuff. And I'm talking about, no, this is part of their culture. GitLab, for example, have teams that work on developing social connection and community because they understand that loneliness is the first step towards burnout or mental health issues. And GitLab, once again, one of their values is around being able to document effectively, because documentation is a critical business asset for them.
Yep.
So really digging into these companies made me realize that they focused down on these 9 best practices because they didn't have an office to do it for them.
Mm. Yeah, that's very true. I actually been doing some little bit of reading and research around this, and GitLab, I believe, have got 8,500 pages of open source documentation of how they run their business.
They do. I wouldn't say I've read it all, but I've read a lot of it, and it's a beautiful thing. It's actually poetry in reading motion. The beautiful thing about it is when you say, these guys, okay, they've been going for 10 years and they've got 1,300 staff. So they've been doing this a while. But when you say to somebody, you've got to write 8,300 pages, if you printed it out, that's how many pages. People just get terrified and they're like, God, we hardly get our people to put everything in Salesforce, never mind anything else. Yeah. But actually each one of those pages is a working document. It's a live working document. It has an owner. It's curated. It's maintained, because they have a discipline around documentation that works. And you can go and have a look at it now. You can follow the URLs all the way through the document. It really is a fabulous piece of art.
Yeah, I'd only discovered this a few weeks ago, so I went, wow. And GitLab essentially has been a remote run business ever since day dot, I think.
Yeah.
So, all right. So let's dive into the 9 steps. I think it'd be great to have a little bit of a little dive into each one. So let's start with the first one.
Yeah. So if we look at social connection, what's essentially happened is, and I did some survey in April of 165 UK companies, and everybody was saying, "Wow, productivity's up, and we're great." But actually, I've since then done another survey, and 85% of those companies are saying that social connection has fallen off a cliff because people are not happy. They're tired of Zoom. They don't, get me on another Zoom call. Really, come on, and also the drinks on Fridays have lost their meaning. The quiz nights have lost their meaning. So if you look at what companies like GitLab do, they have teams that work on this. They form micro communities. They are very deliberate as an organization around social community, social connection. But what they particularly do is they don't make it the leadership's responsibility. They make it the company's responsibility. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the issues around mental health and burnout and well-being, this is the first step to overcome. I believe there's a tsunami wave of problems coming down the line for companies. We're all experiencing some kind of burnout in some way, and that's just going to accelerate if companies don't use their culture in the right way. The second point is communication. So the key here is moving from synchronous to asynchronous communication. So synchronous communication requires presence and availability. And you and I need to be available at these times to talk. Mm-hmm. That means if you and I are talking and it's not really effective, that means you're wasting, or I'm wasting, an hour of my time when I could be working. Mm-hmm. And so what we're finding is with companies who are struggling with this is they're doing 8 or 9 hours of Zoom calls a day, and then they're spending 6 or 7 hours catching up on the work they should have done today. And if you look at a company like Basecamp, the leadership they do zero. They do no synchronous communication, only emergencies. Mm-hmm. So all of their communication is around email or whatever it is, and then don't expect a response immediately. Don't expect the person to be available and present. And so moving your business from synchronous, from a right first mentality, from a think first mentality to a right first mentality is critical. The third point is process. So processes often live in people's heads. And if you're in an office, that's fine, because you can go bump into somebody and say, what do we do here? What do we do there? And they'll explain to you. But if you're not in an office and you're fully remote, if you're a new joiner to a team or a new joiner to the company, you've actually got to call somebody up and say, what's the process here? How do I fit in? Versus a company like GitLab or Hotjar or Buffer, they've detailed the process. It's defined, and you can go and read it. So you don't have to waste anybody's time. There's no bottleneck to you understanding how the business works. So they process everything. They process meetings. Meetings have a structure. This is how we do meetings in this organization. This is how we do all hands in this organization. There's no variable. And if there is a variation, it's detailed, and the variation is detailed. The fourth point is what we mentioned earlier, which is documentation. Documentation is essentially, if you don't, you need to know what's going on in the organization. And what used to happen is we, listen in to a conversation or meet in the pub or have lunch and talk to somebody or just have a chat. That can't happen anymore because we're all zoomed out. So you need to document everything. If you don't document your culture, how can some new joiner understand what your culture is? If you don't document the onboarding, how can your team onboard effectively? Et cetera, et cetera. So taking the process and then building the documentation around it is absolutely critical. Companies are terrified by this because they don't like documentation. They're not very good at it, and they're scared of it. But if you think about, how a company like GitLab do documentation, every document has a predefined owner, an audience, a cadence, and a lifespan, how long it's lived for. The owner is one individual. The audience is internal company, internal project, internal short-term exercise, or external customers, or the web. And so each document is very well specifically defined and has an owner who will look after the document versus lots of documents going to die in a Google folder somewhere. Mm-hmm. And then the two that work really quite hand in hand are building trust. So most remote companies focus on transparency. Because if we're transparent, we have nothing to hide. You can trust us. Mm-hmm. And they work really, really hard on transparency and building psychological safety, where you trust people to respect who you are, and you trust people not to chop your head off if you make a mistake. And then this feeds into the next point, which is the next best practice, which is outcomes-based leadership. So if you are very clear in what your expectation is, in 3 weeks' time, you will deliver this. Can you deliver it? Yes. And you map that out with the individual. Then you don't have to micromanage them. They will come to you if they have any issues. And so being outcomes-based requires trust, but it also requires the outcome being well-defined and clarity around that. And then the sort of last three are the companies that I've studied really tweak their recruitment and onboarding processes. So that the recruitment and onboarding evaluate for values fit and demonstrate the culture immediately. So that this is the kind of company you want to work at in both recruitment process and onboarding process. And the well-being, mental health, and burnout issues that are coming down the line, this is something that they work very, very hard on to find a balance. Mm-hmm. And they encourage their leaders to talk about what they're struggling with. And to be open about their issues, because then it allows people to realize you're not Superman or Superwoman, you are just a human being. And the last thing is being deliberate about company culture. They didn't have the luxuries of an office. They didn't have the luxuries of the four walls to build their culture. They had to be deliberate about it from day one. And if you look at all of these companies, they culture is one of their major assets, if not their major asset.
Right. And that's that becomes obvious as you look at the different companies that are doing the remote models as well, such as you mentioned, like Remote Lab, Buffer, and so on.
Yeah.
So what are some of the, I suppose, companies that have impressed you the most regarding remote work and remote and hybrid work?
So I think the companies that are GitLab clearly are very, very high up. There's a company called Hotjar.
Yes.
And they're the four founders are out of Malta. And Malta is only a very tiny island, as you know. But actually, as soon as they decided to found the company, they never ever met deliberately again, even for drinks, because they never ever wanted to create an us and them situation. So the challenge with running a remote environment, if you're all in one place, is the leadership will end up meeting, and then people will then congregate around leadership, and you end up feeling like second-class citizens. Mm-hmm. So the first thing Hotjar did is insist on the 4 leaders never meeting again. But one of the things that I really like about them is they spend about 10,000 euros a year on their teams, on perks every year. Mm-hmm. So in year 1, it's 14,000 euros because they give you a 4,000 euros office setup. Mm-hmm. And so you can spend $4,000 on whatever you need in your office. And then it's 10 grand is on, they pay you to take a holiday. They pay you to meet up with your team. They pay you for wellness. They've got a bunch of things that it's 500 a year, or $2,000 a year, or $1,000 a year. And they're basically saying your mental health and your wellness is really critical to us. So build that into how you work. Another company that I'm sort of blown away by with their transparency is Buffer. With Buffer, you can literally go to the website now and work out what people's salaries are, because the salary calculations are there, clear for everybody to see. You can see it's based on how long somebody's worked, their experience, etc., and the calculation is there. So they've actually taken opening the kimono to new lengths from a transparency point of view. And as you mentioned, what I really like about the guys from Basecamp is if you look at their diaries, they have very, very open diaries. They have no meetings booked in their diaries, the leaders of Basecamp, because they've built such a strong culture around get on with it. It's autonomy. It's about, you are accountable, make decisions, take decisions, get on with it. We don't need us. We'll get involved when you really need us, or on the strategy side. So yeah, there are so many companies doing so many interesting things. It's an endless well of insight.
Mm. It's fascinating that transparency is just one indicator to compare it to the old way of work culture.
Yeah.
I think back to when I left teaching and went into working in corporate culture, in the middle of the PC revolution and technology, and it was certainly the culture was us and them. The leaders sort of have their own little perks and they have everything else, and that's fine. The transparency certainly wasn't there. There was a lot of under the table stuff, as in stuff you didn't even know was going on. Whereas these companies like Buffer and so on, GitLab, we're documenting everything we do. There's almost no secrets, which really pushes and excuse me. And when you've had decades of ingrained practice that has taught you that this is how things are, the biggest challenge, I think, with management and the owners of companies is to retrain themselves. So how would you suggest, older people such as myself, I'm 64 this year, so I've had decades of baked in practice, but I still run a company that runs completely remotely, so I learned to learn a little bit more about, I have changed, and I quite enjoy it, frankly. So how do management unlearn?
Yeah, this is one of the reasons I run my business the way I do. So I don't typically work with larger companies, and I don't typically work with older companies, because I don't want to spend time undoing like years and years of bad practice, bad habits, bad rituals, bad norms, bad behaviors. But I think the best way to do this is to look at the 9 best practices and go, okay, what's realistically the low-hanging fruit for our organization? What can I move the needle on? Because in most companies, these 9 are not being done well anyway. So if transparency is going to be a step too far for you at this stage, then I don't think you should go and throw everything open, because actually that may cause more disruption in your organization. And you need to first of all get your head around what transparency means and the levels of transparency you can go to, and then decide how you bring that across. Because some companies are fully transparent, like Buffer, where salaries are all structured and organized. But other companies say, if it's confidential and private to the individual, we don't share it. So salaries are not shared. And other companies, for example, will say, because we're across 5 continents, by law, we can't share certain things. So it really depends on your company and your organization. But the more you can share, the less people doubt you and the less people question you. And you don't want that. You want people to trust you, because they then will get on with what they need to do. You need to trust them. So I think if you look down those 9, you can start at the low-hanging fruit. For example, social connection feels like whatever, but actually it's a really critical piece, because people got social connection from the office, and that's no longer there. And they now are looking for some sort of connection. And the people who you think are the least likely to end up burning out or getting real anxiety and stress and mental issues, they're the ones who often are the ones very often likely to be affected by this. So building out your social connection and taking a team, building a committee and say, okay, what are we going to do on the ground here? Let's go and get people involved in this. And moving social connection on, just that demonstrates that you're aware, you're thinking about it, and it shows your people that you are adapting to the situation. If your head is in the sand and the wind is blowing, and the situation is what it is, and you're not adapting, your people are going, well, we signed this agreement to work for your company, but actually we have another agreement which is we didn't sign, but we it's a intrinsic agreement that you would look after us, you would build a culture that we would want to work in. We made these assumptions about what you told us about working at your company, and so far you've delivered on them, but now our culture is changing and you're not adapting. Why? What's happening? Why are you not adapting to the fact that I'm working from home and I'm sharing a flat with 3 other people, and you don't realize that my situation is different now? You're not building the systems and the communication capabilities and the structural capabilities and the process communication capabilities for me to do my job. So that's really where leaders have to think about, what's the low-hanging fruit to get started with.
Yeah, that's some really good points there. The other thing that I suppose I'm curious about is facilitating all this culture, the changing it, managing it, making sure people's social connections are maintained, documenting processes. That raises the question is, what are some of the key tools that you've found to be really good to help facilitate this? Because we need technology tools to help us do this now, and of course Zoom is one of those. What are some of the other tools that you've come across and recommend to people that you think are just help with these 9 rules that you've mentioned?
So I don't think anybody's got it right yet, but companies will. But there are companies that are doing elements of this. So there's a company called Notion that comes out of California, and they basically have created a wiki where you can start to document everything that you need to document about your business. And essentially you can bring task management, project management, and document management all into one place. There's a company called Donut, for example. They plug into Slack and they set up random meetings between people, because what's happening now is, what you used to do is you used to bump into Jamie from engineering, at the drinks once every 2 weeks. Now you don't speak to Jamie at all, ever, in 6 months. Yep. So this would make you and Jamie reconnect. It makes, there are companies like Tandem that have created a virtual room type environment where it'll tell you, the app will tell you where people are working, what they're working on, are they available, are they not available. So it kind of brings the visibility an availability element back, so you're not completely blind as to what's happening in with your team or with the other people in the organization. There are a bunch of really interesting technologies that are being developed. Nobody's got it right yet, though. I think there's a big chance for a company to build an operating system here.
That's a very interesting term. So it's an operating system for remote work and remote culture, or remote work, frankly. Remote companies, yeah. Well, it was about a year ago, one of my team suggested we use Trello, and which is owned by Atlassian now. They bought them, I think, in 2016. And literally it's changed our company. It's we have less emails, we've got better management. There's a lot more to go on it. Look, what I do compared to the likes of Buffer is just chalk and cheese. But everyone's still trying to work out, because it's happened so quickly, is that there's a bunch of tools that are out there to use. Everyone's trying to discover them. Some are using them. And the other challenge for companies is every company's different. There is no 10 commandments for remote working. Well, we try to have one. You've got 9 commandments. It's pretty close. You may be missing one commandment. I don't know.
I didn't think about that. Now that I think about it, I should have created a 10th just so that I could have the commandments. But actually, the way to think about this is, if you imagine how we used to work, most of what we did was synchronous. Even email, which is more of a semi-synchronous or an asynchronous tool, was treated like a synchronous tool. People responded immediately, and you were almost annoyed or pissed off if somebody didn't respond to your email immediately. And actually, the things like company handbooks or knowledge bases and wikis and collaborative documentation and collaborative works like Trello, those didn't really come into play.
No.
But if you think about it now, you're moving from synchronous to asynchronous, which means you're moving from low permanence of data to high permanence of data. You want to retain everything in your organization because people don't know what's going on. You want people to be able to find out information about what was said there and then. So moving from email and one-to-one meetings or in-person meetings to chat like Slack and Teams, to forums like Twist and Discord, to project and task tools like Trello and GitHub, to Google Docs and Dropbox and Paper. This is what companies move away from synchronous to asynchronous. And how you work out what works for your company is really dependent on how fast you move to asynchronous and how hard you push to be asynchronous. Because if you don't, you will burn your people out.
Yeah.
In a year's time, we're gonna have a whole new kettle of chaos when it comes to remote people who are working remote, even in a hybrid environment, is really suffering from what I call second-class citizen status, where they don't feel respected, they don't feel like a first-class citizen in the office.
Yeah, this whole area is fascinating in the sense of a lot of traditional companies, I think, are really going to struggle, like law firms, accounting firms, that could do the work remotely quite easily, but they don't have the tools to do it. They don't have the culture to do it. They've got decades of, in fact, you're almost talking centuries of embedded practices. This is the way we've always done it. And for me, I was dragged a little bit kicking and screaming to use Trello by my team, and they're going, look. And then I was about a month or two late. I said, trust me, I'm going to get with the program, and I did. And I sort of said jokingly to the guys, I said, it's changed my life. That's just one tool. And some of the different strategies and tactics to help people, I suppose, nurture their culture so that mental health's maintained, social connections are maintained, documenting everything, processes. And like, for example, Trello, I can use it to document. I give a context at the beginning as an intro, and then I have a chain of information that tells where it's all up to, and everyone knows where we're up to. And then the quality of work goes up, everyone feels a bit better. But it's going to be a real challenge, I think, for the older companies and traditional companies that literally got almost a century or more of practices that revolved around face-to-face communication versus the newer companies that are emerging. So there's going to be even more disruption.
Yeah.
Welcome to 2021 and beyond. It's I'm sort of excited. I'm sort of slightly scared. Scared's not the right term, but I just feel there's so much to do, and I think the challenge for all of us as CEOs and owners of businesses and managers and just teamwork, teams, is that we're going to have to keep embracing change, and most humans are very afraid of change.
Yeah, the funny thing about company culture is if it's done right, it gives you stability and adaptability and adaptability at the same time. So it gives you the stability of knowing these are the underlying foundations of the organization, but it gives you the adaptability to get the feedback in, to get in information and then adapt, because that's what your culture does.
Yeah.
And so building that strong culture around adaptability and feedback is one of the key elements of 2021.
Yeah, one of the key elements couple of key areas I'm going to be looking at this year as part of different, of course, launching a couple of new products is process and documentation. I haven't done enough of that because that allows you to scale if you've got that, if you've got things documented and you've got processes developed and evolving. It means that everyone knows how to do it, and you can scale it without having to reinvent the wheel every time. And that's part of what we're doing this year. It's become important. I just need to tell the team now.
I think there's people don't realize the impact of the human bottleneck, and the human bottleneck now is really quite acute because of Zoom and that is really demonstrating where the human bottleneck is. And to remove the human bottleneck from almost any part of the organization, you need documentation.
I totally agree. And what I love about doing this podcast, for example, is that I get lessons in evolving corporate change and entrepreneurship 101, 102, 103 and beyond from very smart people such as yourself that bring a lot to the table that I am fascinated by. And the thing too in business, networking is a term you mentioned early on in our conversation. I'm not going to be able to network anymore. What's fantastic about this thing I'm doing right here, right now with you is when we bump into each other and finally do have a drink in Portugal, maybe Porto or Lisbon, maybe down the track when we can travel again internationally, I feel like I already will know you because we've had an hour's conversation, we've shared stories. How'd you get here? And for me, the podcast, number one, is about building relationships. The rest is will just pop out of that beautiful, glorious mist of human connections. And that, for me, it's a world of infinite possibility. And I don't know what they are, but I just know they are there and will happen.
Yeah. It's. I think this. What you're doing is really tremendous, because yes, you and I have spoken for an hour, but actually people have listened to us speak for an hour, and our network is going to grow significantly through this conversation. And I regularly will get it pinged by somebody saying, heard you talk on that podcast, and really enjoyed the book. When you're next in Miami, would love to pick your brains about this. When we can travel again, etc., etc. So exactly along those lines. It's kind of networking for the COVID era.
It's what I call networking on steroids. It only took me 3 or 4 years to get the podcast going because I had a human condition called procrastination, and I had the podcast equipment sitting in a cupboard, and finally brought it out after being motivated by some good friends over a long lunch in Sydney, overlooking Sydney Harbour, and I suddenly realised where the real power of sitting down and doing a podcast. We put this podcast both onto YouTube as well, and we do a transcript. So we turn this into 3 types of media, and then we carve it up into small snippets. And I'm removing the human bottleneck by giving what we're creating some scale, and that's what's I love. So one of my mantras is, in life, I think for us as humans to really thrive and flourish, is number 1, we need to discover why we're here on the planet. Number 2, we need then to create and be creators, because I think innately we're human creators. Whether you create a business, create a piece of art, a piece of photography. The third, the Holy Trinity then is number 3, is to share that gift with the world. The rest is just detail.
Yeah.
And I sincerely believe in that, because that's been my experience the last 12 years, is discover while I'm here, and number 2, create. And that was writing, and creating a platform. And then number 3 was driven by the social media revolution, was sharing that. And I really think the intersection of doing those 3 things is it's where the magic happens.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I definitely agree with that.
So just to, I'm aware of your time, it's about 11 p.m. in Portugal, and I know you're passionate about it, so you said, I'm not going to fall asleep. No, you're not, don't even look close to falling asleep. So what are 2 or 3 things as takeaways that you'd like to share with my listeners and viewers? What is 2 or 3 things that you think are really important, maybe where companies can start to build a powerful culture and healthy culture that works in this new world we're moving into, the remote and hybrid work, remote models?
Yeah, I think the first thing is as I discussed, just realize that it has changed, and you really do need to adapt. You've got to get ahead of this thing. You don't want to get dumped by the wave. You want to ride the wave. And I think that's really the critical thing. A lot of people are thinking, hopefully this will go back to something like it was, and it's not going to. I think the second thing is company culture is not, it is this invisible, subconscious, intangible thing, but it's actually, if you do a little bit of work on it, it's not that difficult. You just you've got to define it, and then you've got to know how to embed it. And a lot of companies do the work on defining the values and the mission and vision, and then they don't know what to do next. And unsurprisingly, I would recommend they read my book, Own Your Culture, which will help them with that embedding and managing piece of their culture. And I think the third thing is that people need this. Their people, our people, the people who work for us need this stability. They need us to do this because they don't have it at home. They don't have it in their friends. They don't have it anywhere else. They require us to give them a sense of purpose and meaning and strength and conviction, and give them that culture that'll help them get through these tough times.
So essentially what you're saying, give them the framework and tools to thrive.
Exactly.
Great. I think it's a great spot to end, Brett. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. And good luck with unboxing your gear in Portugal. I know that you said that you had I think origami house, which is full of boxes of paper. So I've been there. I feel your pain. But as we know that tomorrow there'll be one more box unpacked, and you'll be enjoying Portuguese sun. So great to have you on the show. And just before we finish too, how can people find Brett Putter?
Jeff, really enjoyed the show. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure. So people can find me via culturegene.ai, which is culturegene.ai. If people want to email me, I spend 20-25% of my time talking about culture, because I'm an internal student of culture, and they can literally email me, brett@culturegene.ai. I'm happy to chat. I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm on Twitter, etc. And yeah, people are happy to chat, happy to talk.
Great. Thank you very much for your time. It's been great to have a virtual chat from the other side of the world, which happens all the time.
It does indeed. Thanks, Jeff.